real substantial progress, and we're very optimistic with the trend line that we are seeing moving forward. For me, and what you hear so much talked about, we've heard this from the beginning of this pandemic, is how can we achieve herd immunity? So to me, a simplified definition of herd immunity, it's that point at which the epidemic nature stops. Percent of the population with some immunity, which is up in the upper right there, you see. And that's about 232 million people in the United States need to have some degree of immunity. Now, there's two ways to get immunity, right? You can get immunity because we put a shot in your arm, and the shots are highly effective and highly safe. You can get immunity because you've had an infection. We do believe that the actual shot is far more effective at giving you long-standing durable immunity and the quantity of immunity you get. So even if you've had COVID, we do recommend getting a shot, and we'll talk more about that later. So that's 232 million people. Let's say that's the number we need to achieve. Now you see there the number of eligible adults is higher than that. But the reality is probably not everybody's going to want to get vaccinated, going to agree to get vaccinated. So if you could convince 3/4 of eligible adults, you're right at 200 million. So by vaccination alone, we probably can't achieve herd immunity, at least until we start to make vaccines eligible, kids eligible for vaccines. Then we can get a bunch of those children in that other group vaccinated. So we're going to need either to convince a lot of people to get vaccinated to get there, or we're going to need to have a pretty significant baseline of people in the community who have had the infection. Now, most of the prevalence studies now, certainly a Texas-wide prevalence study that's been done by the UT School of Public Health, suggests we're in the 20-25% range of people running around with some antibodies. So they've had infection. And so and it's bad news if you've had infection, but a good news from a herd immunity threshold standpoint is you already start with 20% or so of people with relatively good immunity. Then you start layering on all the people we vaccinate. And we can get pretty close, at least, to this 70% threshold if people go out and get vaccinated. So let me show you some of the data here in terms of what I think is possible. And if you'll bear with me, I think I'm going to need my glasses for this part here. But this is what the government has committed to delivering in terms of vaccine doses with the three major manufacturers. I put together this slide at the end of February, right at the beginning of March, and I've not changed it. So this is what they said at that time they would get out. So in other words, by the end of March, supposed to have 240 million cumulative doses, another 116 million coming in the month of April. You can see the numbers thereafter. In green, you can see there's been about 180, so it's not quite hitting the numbers they said. Now the Pfizer numbers, there's some discrepancy in the numbers because of the doses per vial. So the 180 may be a little low. And remember, there's still 3 days in March. So I think we're going to be in about the 190 million dose range. And if you correct it for some of the vials, it's probably around 200. So not quite what they said, but most of what they said. And I think looking at then significant supply coming in these next 3 months, even if it's not quite what they say. And so cumulatively, that's enough shots getting distributed that we could have 130 million people who are vaccinated at this point in time, 200 plus million, which is about what we're going to get to, I think, by the end of April. But that's only if they got into people immediately. That probably won't happen. So I put together some numbers looking, again, about a month ago at where I thought we could get based on realistic timing of getting the vaccines out to full immunity. So you need to get shot number 1, then shot number 2, then wait another couple weeks to have full immunity. And at February, we knew that number, pretty solidly, at least who'd been vaccinated. Making some estimates by end of March, at the time I was estimating about 51.8 million people. You can see the numbers marching out there. Actually, where we are as of yesterday, so we have 3 days to go, and a Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, so there'll be reasonably big days at 51.6. So we'll actually come ahead of this course. Actually, we're pretty close to that estimate right now. And so what you see in this, and I'll cross out some of the numbers that don't make any sense, because by July, we will have so much vaccine out there. In theory, you could have vaccinated, some people more than once, which of course isn't going to happen. And so the reality is by May, June, we can have everybody who wants to be vaccinated and fully immune. So as long as everybody goes out and does their part and gets vaccinated, we will be in a really good place this summer as a community. Now, if people don't go out and get vaccinated, That won't happen. And so this next 60 to 90 days is critically important. And we all know literally today was the day the state of Texas said anybody can get vaccinated over age 16. And so, you know, you're going to see a significant expansion of vaccine availability, but you can sign up now. And so I strongly encourage you, get on a list, get signed up. You're going to find, I think, that if you sign up within a few weeks most, you're going to get that first shot and you're going to be protected by the end of May if you go through with that. Now, we talked a lot a couple weeks ago about the fact that many of the mandatory orders stopped in the state of Texas. Restrictions completely ceased at the time. Now, those are mandatory orders. That doesn't mean we can't still wear masks. In fact, when you look at those numbers and you say, look, by end of June, which is basically 90 days from now, everybody who wants to be vaccinated will be vaccinated. Not only will they be vaccinated, but they'll be far enough out that they're fully immune. And you add that to the population that's already had the infection, we're going to be pretty close by end of June to that threshold, that herd immunity threshold. So if we all continue doing the right things, wearing masks when we're together with other individuals, even if you've been vaccinated, when you're going out into the community out of respect for others, keep that mask on. And the good news is in about 90 days, I think that can change pretty significantly for all of us if we all do the right thing. And so I'm very optimistic about that going forward. My key points I want you to walk out with today, and all of our key points: the vaccines are safe and effective. Get one immediately when it's your turn. And now it's everybody's turn. So, you know, go find a place to get in line and get it. Be patient, because still we've gotten to, you know, about a third of eligible adults. That means there's still 2/3 who haven't gotten there. Some of those don't want it, but most of those I think do. And most of those really we need to get vaccinated. Really, we can move through them very quickly this month to the next 2 months. Remember, the state creates the prioritization. Now, of course, it's wide open. Recognize, and we'll talk about that, there are some side effects, but they're mild. They're very common, but they're way, way better than getting COVID. And we'll talk about some of that kind of risk-benefit analysis, because for almost every human being on the planet, it makes sense to get the COVID vaccine. I mean, I'm talking 99.999% of people on the planet should be getting the vaccine if they have the opportunity. Take the first vaccine you're offered anywhere, anytime. You'll see that. We consider them equivalent for what really matters, which is keeping people out of the hospital and keeping people from dying. And then for now, at least, even after vaccination, please continue wearing the mask and continuing physical distancing. One last graphic about the two-way street of how masks protect all of us. And thank you for the privilege of being here. We'll have a significant Q&A session coming up in a few minutes. Thank you. And now we're going to turn to Dr. Sostman, our Chief Academic Officer.
Great. Thank you, Arianne. Thank you, Marc. I'm delighted to be here, and I'm going to try to, in about 10 or thereabouts minutes, go into some of the science about the vaccine. The slides will be available on the website, so I'm going to go through them rather quickly, but if there's anything you want to look at later, you can go on the website. And we're actually, you know, we're always happy to answer questions. So let's start with the basics. How do these vaccines work? Now, you may know that most traditional vaccines are either the live but weakened virus or a killed virus, but it's the entire virus that you're getting. And this can cause some off-target effects. It also makes the development of these vaccines very, very slow, because you've got to grow trillions and trillions and trillions and trillions of viral particles in either cell cultures or eggs or something like that. The newer technology that the 3 COVID vaccines that we're talking about is basically to encapsulate a small amount of genetic instructions in some kind of carrier, either a totally synthetic lipid nanoparticle or a harmless viral particle. Introduce them into your body. The genetic material is taken up by your cells and used as instructions to produce the protein carried by the coronavirus that is probably the easiest target for immunity. So let's look at this. Here is a table of the 3 currently approved vaccines by Moderna, Pfizer, and Johnson & Johnson, as well as the 2 that are probably next in line for review by the FDA, the AstraZeneca and the Novavax. And there's a lot of numbers on here. I want you to remember that the numbers that you see quoted for different vaccines are not going to be exactly totally comparable. Rule of thumb, yes, but don't get too hung up on the exact numbers, because we're talking about different clinical trials, we're talking about 1 dose versus 2 doses, we're talking about different outcome criteria, different lengths of follow-up. These trials are done in different countries at different times during the pandemic. So not exactly head-to-head comparisons. But let's look at how these vaccines perform. Well, the least reliable data that we have, I'm going to start with the fuzziest numbers, is the asymptomatic infections. How good are these vaccines at protecting against the mildest forms of infection? And the reason this question is important is because it's the asymptomatic spread that makes this disease so difficult to deal with. The idea that you could be infected, not know it, and go around spreading the virus to other people. So this is a really important number, and the fact that we don't have a good, precise handle on it is one of the big reasons why, as Marc Boom said, we want you to keep wearing your masks even after you've been vaccinated, until everybody's been vaccinated, and then we can have the biggest block party of all time. Anyway, the numbers that you'll see quoted here is anywhere from 60 to 90% effectiveness against asymptomatic infection. I believe, and I think the evidence that continues to accumulate, is that the vaccines will protect against asymptomatic infection and transmission in a degree pretty similar to their protection from symptomatic infection. That's what I believe. That's, I think, where the data is going, but we're not quite there yet. The numbers that you'll probably hear most quoted are the protection against symptomatic infection. And there you've got the 2 messenger RNA vaccines in the 95% range. The Johnson & Johnson in about 70%-ish, and then the other 2 in the 70 to 85% range. Again, I would not get too hung up on these numbers. The key points here is that all of the vaccines on this slide easily clear the FDA's 50% efficacy bar. The South African variant that you may have read about probably reduces the efficacy of the vaccines, but except perhaps in the case of the AstraZeneca vaccine, does not eliminate it. But really, what's the big goal here? It's to keep people out of the hospital and to keep people out of the morgue. And all of these vaccines do an outstanding job of that. All of the major vaccines provide really good protection from severe illness in the 85 to 100% range. And all of the major vaccines provide good protection against hospitalization and death. Basically 100%. This is really a miracle. I can't tell you how incredible this is. The J&J vaccine is kind of the new kid on the block, so let me go into this in a little bit more detail. You've probably read about the other two quite a bit. This is the genetic instructions here are delivered by a harmless adenovirus. Its efficacy is about 70% for symptomatic COVID, close to 80% after a month, 90% after 6 weeks at preventing severe disease, and 100% at preventing hospitalization and death. Key point here is that this is with only one dose. And the little graphic on the slide, the orange and green bars, show how the antibodies come up after you get your vaccine, compared to the colorless bars, which are the placebo or the sugar water. And it just shows both in people, the green is people who are under 65, the orange is people over 65. It just shows how good this is. This may be a little easier to get a hold of because the storage requirements are more forgiving. And it may be that the so-called reactogenic effects may be a little bit less. Real-world data, that was all clinical trials, very carefully controlled research. Real-world data is absolutely bearing out the results of the research. In Israel, which has got a very, very high percentage of people vaccinated, 96% protection from infection. Scottish data, 85 to 95% reductions in hospitalization. English data, efficacy against symptomatic disease, 75 to 90%. And here at Houston Methodist, where 85% more or less of our employees have been vaccinated, the positive test rate in our employees has gone down 95%. So this is just stunning. I mean, this is as good as it gets in medicine. Safety. A lot of people are concerned about safety, as we'll maybe have a chance to discuss in the question section. I think this is totally mistaken thinking. People are not good at assessing risks. But what do we know about the safety of the vaccines? Well, from the clinical trials, I can almost guarantee you that if you get this vaccine, you'll get a sore arm for a day or two, maybe more sore or less sore. I think there's a good chance that if somebody says, hey, you got the vaccine, how'd you feel? I say, well, I felt a little tired, I had a little bit of a headache. The chance of having a severe allergic reaction, which is the one thing that we learned in the real world experience that we didn't find out in the clinical trials, the chance of having a severe allergic reaction is somewhere between 2 and 5 instances per million. So about the same as the influenza vaccine, which I think everybody views as pretty safe. These reactions are treatable. To my knowledge, no one has died in America of one of these reactions. And if you look at the risk-benefit, this is the assessment of risk piece. 330 million people live in America. 550,000 people have died of COVID. You have about a 1 in 600 chance, if you're an American, of death from COVID. You have about a 5 per million chance of having a severe allergic reaction that will be scary and inconvenient. There's nothing to choose between this. I mean, this is just, It's understandable that people focus on the safety of the vaccine because they feel great, they feel normal, they feel fine when they're asked to have the vaccine. You know, when you're in the ICU gasping for breath and about to have a tube shoved down your throat, that's not the right time to be thinking about risks. The good news, we've got, as Dr. Boom said, tons of supply heading in our direction. We're given almost 3 million doses of vaccine a day in America now. Anybody who says that, you know, America can't do great things anymore, you know, we're looking at a great thing happening all around us right now. If everybody who can get vaccinated does, we can approach population immunity this summer. That means by the fall, kids can be in school all over the country. You can go to restaurants, you can go to bars, you can get together with friends. That's if all goes well. What could go wrong? Well, one would be the premature reopening of society leading to a fourth wave. Probably the biggest concern is these viral variants. Can they outrun the vaccination programs? It does appear that some of these variants reduce the efficacy of the vaccines. I'm not going to go into this data because it's really changes every day, but so far it looks like there's no variants that totally destroy the effectiveness of the vaccines, but some of them do reduce them. So in the future, there's going to be a lot of new vaccines available over the coming months and years. These variants are probably going to require us to have booster shots every year for the next several years. Personally, I think in the winter, when it's respiratory virus season, you would be well advised to wear a mask. I certainly plan to. Probably eventually COVID is going to become just a seasonal common cold type illness, but that's going to be a long time from now. So buckle up, get your vaccine, stay safe, and we will get there. So thank you.
Thank you so much for those presentations. They were really quite helpful. We have plenty of time today available to answer some of the questions that you all have. So I'd like to spend maybe the next 30 minutes or so just going through questions we've received from the audience, and I'll ask them to each of you if that works okay for everyone. So the first question, one of the main questions that we've heard is, what side effects, if any, and this is to each of you, what side effects, if any, did you experience when you received the vaccine? Dr. Neal, we'll start with you.
I can start. You know, I'm well known to be a big baby when it comes to taking shots. So I was so excited to find out that there were 2 shots to take for this vaccine. But I was pleased to find out 2 things. The folks giving the shots were incredibly experienced. It was very literally a painless venture on the initiation of the shot. I understood and expected that we'd have some side effects on the second shot just based on how it works, and I was prepared. I actually decided to take Tylenol 30 minutes before the shot and then 8 hours after, and I really had minimal symptoms. I felt sort of like I had gone to the gym and had some generalized aches and pains, but by the end of the evening, all of that had subsided. No.
Yeah, I had very minimal side effects. So I was able to get vaccinated about 10, 12 days after we started vaccinating in December, after we'd had thousands of our employees vaccinated, and had a mildly sore arm the first time, a mildly sore arm the second time, and that's it. In fact, I sat there thinking, I wish I was having more side effects, because then I knew it was working. So it really wasn't bad at all. My wife's a pediatrician. She got vaccinated, one of the first people in Houston, because she was running some of the vaccine distribution at Texas Children's. She had minimal side effects. My daughter's a medical student. She had minimal side effects. Those are all Pfizer. And to show you how much I believe believe in the vaccines. My 15-year-old daughter, who's not eligible for a vaccine, we worked really hard to get her enrolled in a trial, and she was enrolled in the Moderna trial and had very mild symptoms with both shots. So we think she did get the actual vaccine. But so we believe deeply in this, and everybody in my family, as soon as they have a chance, is getting vaccinated.
Pretty much the same. I had sore arm, actually a little worse the first time. Maybe the person who was giving the vaccines wasn't quite as gentle. I don't know, but both times, and maybe I was a little tired. I know that the night that I got the vaccine was probably the best night's sleep I'd had in the preceding 9 months. And I don't know if that's because I was a little fatigued or just because I was, thank God I'm not going to die.
Well, thank you. I think it's good to know, if you have a reaction, that's okay. And if you don't, you're still safe and protected. So let's take a look at the next question. Dr. Sostman, I'll ask this one to you. Based on the slides that you presented earlier, which vaccine do you actually think is the best? If you could pick between the three, or do you have a preference at all between the three vaccines?
Not really. I'd say that the most important thing is to get vaccinated as soon as you can. The AstraZeneca is not approved in the U.S. yet. Probably will come up for approval, in the next couple of months. I'm a little less enthusiastic about that one for two reasons. One is the data in South Africa showing a real reduction in its efficacy against the South African variant. The other is just the company has just handled the clinical trials and the rollout of the data so awkwardly. I think it's actually a good vaccine, and certainly if it were the first that was available to me, once approved, I would get it. I just feel a little less enthusiastic about it.
Yeah, for me it is get the first vaccine that you can get your hands on. Now, what's changing a little bit over the next couple months is for the three, Moderna and Johnson & Johnson and the Pfizer, is there's probably going to be enough that if for some reason choice, you do want to make a choice, like for example, the fact that you could get J&J once and not have to have it again, and it's very difficult for you to get someplace twice, you're going to have a little more ability to do that, I suspect, over the next 2 months than you have had before. But quite honestly, I wouldn't wait. I would go get the first vaccine you can get your hands on.
Thank you. Let's, talking about vaccines, if we can go back to the vaccines again. Dr. Neal, this question is actually for you.
Sure.
There's a lot of concern about the Johnson & Johnson vaccine, probably in part because it's new, being given to communities of color. Some people think it's less effective. Is this true, and what would you say to people in communities of color that have these concerns?
Sure. Thank you for the question. I'd start by the caveat of what I've been exposed to over the last year in taking care of the very sick, those who get placed in the hospital, and some who we are able to get home and some who we are not. And particularly the at-risk community, the people of color who come in and are of the sickest in large part because of multiple comorbidities. The goal for this entity, the goal for these individuals should be to do whatever is possible to not get COVID-19. And at present, what we know from best practices would be to wear a mask, keep a distance, and be very cautious of hand washing and exposure. We now have what I believe to be the quintessential tool to combat the progression of disease, and that's vaccines, and those are vaccines in general. And I would agree with the panel. The first scenario is get whichever vaccine you can that's readily available to you. Get it now, get it early, and if you have to get the 2 shots, get it often. As it relates to the J&J vaccine, I think there's a lot of good components, and I think it actually, in some ways, is probably advantageous to communities of color, particularly those who are economically disadvantaged, don't have access to the computerware to be able to schedule these appointments very quickly. I think there was a recent report on the news where they were giving out 3,000 shots. They put out the information, and it was full in less than an hour. And particularly our older patients in many of these populations who are at risk. So I think the vaccine in general is the first next big step for them to take. I don't think there is a downside at all with the Johnson & Johnson vaccine. I think, as was pointed out before, some of the concern has to do with what its reported initial overall efficacy is. It was a different trial in a different time frame, at different communities. It had probably greater exposure to some of the variants. And in some ways that might be an advantage as we get later into who actually is still getting COVID-19. So I would encourage enthusiastically that in communities of color that they are not biased against any one of the vaccines, that they don't feel concerns about the J&J vaccine. I think what's interesting, Johnson & Johnson Company has had an incredible relationship with America for quite some time. We kind of think of it as this product line that creates all these nice household things. It's actually the largest pharmaceutical company in the world at about $80 billion a year. And it's had some ups and downs with the community scenarios and some of their specific products, but they've always seemed to respond to that responsibly. And I think there's a comfort in knowing that there's a Johnson & Johnson vaccine. So I don't want anyone to get hung up on the original efficacy numbers, because, as Dr. Sostman pointed out, it is 100% efficacious against death and hospitalization.
Thank you. And Dr. Boom?
Yeah, you know, when it first came out, I was very worried about people somehow perceiving it as inferior. And what we've actually seen, because people, I think, have heard that message that what really matters is hospitalization and death and its equivalent. And then they've looked at it and said, you know, it has a bunch of positives, right? It is one shot and I'm done. I don't have to go back 3-4 weeks later if I need those. It probably has a slightly lower side effect profile, so I'm less likely to have side effects, especially on that second dose that sometimes is more with those. So we've actually seen a fair amount of demand for it. And just to put my hat on as CEO of Houston Methodist, you know, we have been mostly a Pfizer shop. So I mean, if you look at those 452,000 doses, the vast majority have been Pfizer, a fair amount of Moderna, particularly early on, and then a couple sporadic times in. So far we've gotten 100 doses of Johnson & Johnson, and they went like that because I had employees who said, you know, I want to take that one. And so we're working very actively with the state to say, give us 2,000-3,000 of those a week. I want to put them in a primary care office so that there's a patient who's a little reluctant, a little hesitant, and they sit there and their primary care physician explains why it's important and says, hey, can I go get the shot, walk back in and give it to you right there? And then that's how we get through concerns. So I actually am not concerned about those equity issues because I see it as a very, very useful vaccine for people who can get it.
Just one last comment. I mean, just think how sad it would be if you waited for, quote unquote, the best vaccine and you got COVID and died while you were waiting.
Very true. Very true. Well, Dr. Boom, if we can go back to what you were talking about with how long it will take for vaccines to work. You just talked about a little bit, but can you tell us how long will it take for each of these vaccines to work? What's the difference with the Johnson & Johnson vaccine as a one shot? And how long do we expect the protection from COVID-19 to last with the vaccines?
So each of them have their own timetable, but if you look at the studies, really about 2 weeks after the first dose, or the only dose if that's what you get with J&J, we start to see significant immunity kicking in. So whether you're measuring people's antibodies or whether you're looking at a population who've gotten each vaccine and then how many continue getting sick, about 2 weeks in you start to see a very positive impact. Now Pfizer requires a booster at 3 weeks, and Moderna requires a booster at 4 weeks. That's just the way they designed them and designed their trials. We know that in the 1 or 2 weeks after your second dosage, you can be considered fully immune. So if you get Pfizer, let's say today, about 5 weeks from now, you can consider yourself fully immune. If you get Moderna today, about 6 weeks from now, you can consider yourself fully immune. If you get Johnson & Johnson, it's 2 to 3 weeks. I would give it a little longer, but you're talking a little shorter time period. What we don't fully know is how long these will last. We know they provide very robust, we're talking amounts of antibody in your bloodstream that are 10 to sometimes 10s or even 100 times what you would see with a natural infection. And so we believe they will be very effective, and the studies are bearing that out. We also believe that means they're more likely to last a longer period of time, but whether they start wearing off, we just don't know yet. There'll be two potential reasons why we might need to get booster shots in the future with any of these vaccines. One is like any other shot, some of them don't last forever. So think about the tetanus shot that we all get, right? You need to get a new tetanus shot every 10 years. And in fact, if you have a bad, puncture wound or something, we'll get it to you even sooner to make doubly sure you don't get tetanus. So we know this may wear out. The other reason is more like the flu shot, where things change and the virus changes. And we're seeing this virus mutate. And so most people are predicting every 1 to 2 years you're probably going to need a booster shot. The other thing we don't fully know yet, and Dr. Sostman had that on his slide, is whether we're going to need a second dose with J&J. Right now it's a 1-dose vaccine, but we just don't know if it will have less durability than the others. I wouldn't let that hold you back from getting whichever it is, because whichever those are, we'll sort that out over the next few months in studies. And if you need a booster, you'll just get a booster in a few months when there's going to be, I think, lots of supply available.
Can I ask you a follow-up to that actually just came in on the chat? When do you expect that hospitals and clinics, now that everything's open for 16 and up across the state, when are hospitals and clinics going to be able to open it up to 16 and older? Are they still following the 1A and 1B categories for now?
Well, so, obviously there's many sites now you can get your vaccine. The hospitals in particular have databases, of course, of the people who come and get service with us, see our physicians, come to our emergency rooms, get admitted to our hospitals. And so we've had a very large list of people where we know for a fact they have 1B conditions. So we've been working down that list very actively. We're in the last bit of people who are in 1B, who have some health condition. So we've been inviting people in their 20s now who have a health condition. So you're seeing within a day or two, we will be inviting 50 and up wide open, and I would predict within a couple of weeks at most we'll be inviting everybody. But today, if you are in the 40 years old and don't have any health issues, we're probably not quite getting you on the schedule. There may be a few situations like that, but that'll happen over the next couple of weeks. But there's many different options right now. I mean, my kid's school, for example, in 2 days has a third party coming in and vaccinating everybody 16 and up who's eligible. And so we're seeing all those opportunities. And with those numbers I showed you of vaccine supply, in the next week, 2 weeks, 3 weeks, you're seeing, I think, very dramatic access improvements continuing.
Thanks very much. Dr. Sostman, this one's for you. When we talk about everyone having an opportunity now to get the vaccine, if you've already had COVID, should you wait for a little bit and allow others to go first, or should you move forward to get the vaccine? And secondly, if you have allergies, not the seasonal allergies that many of us are suffering from today, should you get the vaccine, and which one would you suggest?
Well, we definitely recommend, if you've had COVID, you should be vaccinated. Wait until your symptoms have cleared, but definitely get vaccinated. There's some evidence now that if you've had COVID already, you may only need 1 dose of vaccine to be optimally protected. We'll sort that out over the next few months, but definitely get vaccinated, even if you've had COVID. As far as the allergies, the only allergy that would dissuade me from getting vaccinated with a particular vaccine is if I know that I'm allergic to a specific component of that vaccine. So for the J&J, there's basically no significant allergies to that harmless adenovirus. For the Pfizer and Moderna, they both contain artificial lipids that have some polyethylene glycol in them. So if you know that you will have allergic reactions to polyethylene glycol, I would get the J&J instead of the Pfizer or the Moderna. Other than that, allergies really don't seem to correlate with the development of those very rare severe reactions.
So polyethyl glycine, if I said that correctly, which I probably did not, where would that be found for someone that might not know?
You'll see it on package inserts. It's used a lot as a food stabilizer and many other uses in industry, food, drugs, medications. If you're allergic to it, you will undoubtedly know that.
Okay, that's helpful. Dr. Neal, the next question's for you.
Sure.
As we talked about patients and doctors having a chance to sit down and talk about the vaccine, what are some of the biggest concerns that your patients that you've seen in your office have come in about the vaccine? What are they expressing to you?
Well, two things: patient interactions, and actually even family members and friends who are, always inquiring about what's the next or best step. Clarifying our practice, it's 100% in the hospital for me, so patients are often in for something or something else. Some of them are in with COVID infections and want the same question as to when I should get the vaccine as we sort of just answered. I think there are about 50% or more patients who are planning to get the vaccine. That's their target, that's their goal, no concerns. They're just waiting for it to become available to them and they're going for it. I think there are another 50% or so, and it's just a general assessment, who have some vaccine hesitancy, who have some concerns about all of the things that we've discussed: production, big pharma, the messenger in some of these instances as the government played a role in some of the early rollout. And for those patients, again, we go over the concerns for their clinical risk. Mm-hmm. And they have to understand that the risk of both getting the disease and becoming ill from the disease are much higher than any side effect potential from the vaccine. And so some of them have concerns about tolerance, safety. It's fine when you say, only 1 in a million folks get a really bad reaction. Everybody wants to know, will I be that 1 in a million? And I'd prefer not to have that inconvenience. And so we have very clear discussions both with patients. I've had a lot of these discussions with family. I have a very diverse family. That being said, that means there's doctors and lawyers. That's the diversity of it. And lawyers tend to believe totally different things than a physician. But one of the issues is that what was very interesting is I'm getting calls from my younger generation of nieces and nephews in their 20s and in college courses, and they have a total different array of concerns about what this is. Do I trust this vaccine? What are the side effects long term? Are there untoward effects that aren't yet known? And so it's going to be very interesting. I think once we get through the population that is very comfortable with the vaccine, we really have to look closely at that population that is concerned, mm-hmm. and try to bring them in either compartments or areas of their concern to address those, so that we can continue to push through this June, July goal of attempting to get to herd immunity. Because as Marc pointed out in the numbers, if truly everyone is not on board in participation, we'll have a very, very hard time getting to the number we need.
Yeah, definitely. And Dr. Boom, kind of following up on what Dr. Neal said, talking about younger generations and thinking about women that are thinking about becoming pregnant, nursing, or currently pregnant, what are your feelings and suggestions to them about whether or not they should receive the vaccine?
Thanks, Harry. And that's obviously a very important question, and one that and I'm going to put the disclaimer right off the front. I'm a primary care physician. I am not an obstetrician gynecologist, but I am very familiar with the data, and I've spent a great deal of time talking to our obstetrician leadership here and understanding what they're recommending to their patients. And here's the bottom line. In the studies, there were not large groups of pregnant women studied. I mean, that was not what's there. So no one can sit there and say, we did this clinical trial to say this is how it works in pregnant women. However, we've had tens and tens of thousands of women now who are pregnant, who have received these vaccines, who are in the registries that are there, and there have been no problematic events whatsoever. When you talk to the obstetrician gynecologist, there is no theoretical reason, no medical, clinical, scientific reason for these to be of risk to a mother or to the unborn baby during pregnancy. In fact, it's entirely opposite, which I'll explain in a second. So there's no plausible reason for it to be a problem, and we're not seeing that now with tens of thousands of experience. The reality is that pregnancy is a pretty significant risk factor for COVID. So women who are pregnant, particularly in the period of time around childbirth, so the month or so before and the time after childbirth, have had some real problems with COVID. We have had women on ECMO. ECMO is an artificial lung. So I can think of one patient in particular where she delivered, she was crashing from COVID. We were able to take care of the baby. The baby was fine, went home with the dad. The mom continued to do poorly, ended up on an artificial lung for over a month, never got to meet her child until a month later. It's a there's some significant risk to the mother. There's also some very significant positives. For example, if the mother has antibodies, she will pass along antibodies through breast milk. This is like any other infection that is potential for a newborn, and so she will provide protection to her newborn. So what you're hearing our obstetricians say is, discuss it with your obstetrician, but by and large, not even by and large, they're recommending go ahead and get vaccinated, recognizing obviously there's a personal decision, not all those trials are there, but go ahead and get vaccinated. I will tell you, if it was one of my children who was pregnant, I would in a second say, I want you to go get vaccinated. There's no question. We do this now with flu, we do this with multiple other potential infections to protect both the mother and to protect the unborn infant.
Thanks very much. And I have a question that came through on the chat that I think is actually really important to ask today, just for clarification for people. And I apologize for looking down. What is the difference between EUA, the emergency use authorization, and the typical approval process when we say a vaccine is approved? I know on the paperwork somebody mentioned you see it's approved, but we only have the EUA. So can you explain, Dirk or Dr. Boone, what that difference is?
Sure. The EUA is a faster process and something that, as the name suggests, you authorize the use of the medication because it's an emergency situation. The full authorization requires a longer follow-up, basically.
Mm-hmm. But give you some perspective. We vaccinate something like 170, 180 million Americans for the flu every year. Mm-hmm. We've already given a vaccine to over 130 million people with this. So while it is under that EUA, because you need to have, because it's gone through a different process here, because of course we have an emergency with this virus and with COVID, we're rapidly approaching the numbers that we would normally do in a year for flu, and again seeing the vaccines to be incredibly safe.
Thank you. We have time for maybe about 2 more questions. So this question is for Dr. Neal and Dr. Boone. Dr. Neal, I'll start with you.
Sure.
Access to vaccine shots is an issue for a lot of people, as we talked about briefly. What's being done to make sure all people, and when I say all, I mean all people, no matter if you're homeless, if you live in a suburb or a city or in a rural area, to make sure all people have a chance to receive the vaccine?
Bill, thank you for that question. I'm probably a little biased because I live in Houston, Texas, and I will work at the Methodist Hospital, and have had the opportunity to watch the proactive nature in which early on these questions were asked. Clearly there was the first big push to get vaccine, to get it available, to have it stored, to have the sub-zero freezers and have it accessible to the highest risk group, which were caregivers and the elderly with comorbidities. And now that, at Methodist, the medical center in Houston has done an incredible job with that, not still working to perfect it. We're now at this arena where others who may not have been incorporated prior into the medical center machinery and didn't have direct access into the hospital or the medical center based entities now are wanting their opportunity to get access to the vaccine. And so I do believe, even though I think the response is developing and maturing, that Houston has done an incredible job at identifying those areas that need to be able to access the vaccine more easily, whether it's just community-based, pharmacy-based, or small health clinic based. But I also know that the hospital itself has focused very much on being able to roll these programs out to the community, to be a participant, an active participant in those rollout processes, a very strong community-based movement. And I think what we've heard is that 2 weeks ago, and just pick a time, 2 weeks ago I had a very hard time getting an appointment, getting in and getting accessed, and then 4 weeks later someone calls me and says, we can actually come to your neighborhood, we can move you to a center and let you know where that is if you're having trouble. So it's been an incredible growth process, and I think a very positive move on behalf of Houston, the Texas Medical Center, and particularly Methodist Hospital, and I think our leadership has been forefront in driving that.
Thanks. Dr. Boone, did you want to follow up with anything?
Thank you, Dr. Neal. We're absolutely committed to getting this to every human being we can get this to, and the way that happens has to be purposeful and intentional. I think you mentioned that. And so we recognized from day one that there would be obstacles. And frankly, some of those obstacles are very significant, whether they run the gamut from, you needed minus 70 degrees for the Pfizer vaccine, to the other end of the spectrum, which is vaccine hesitancy, which is not equal in different populations of people across the community, both from, racial and ethnic differences to political preference differences in terms of how people sort of see the world and see their role and see whether or not they want to take a vaccine. But at the end of the day, this virus is the great leveler. Every human being can get it. We saw the Prime Minister of the UK, we saw the President of the United States get this virus. And the only way we can prevent some of the inequities we've seen that you alluded to in terms of death and dying and infection is to get everybody vaccinated. So we continue to be very intentional and purposeful. That runs the gamut, first and foremost, from get this to as many people as you possibly can, because we'll get through the population as a whole very quickly, to then how do we very purposefully go to various communities. So we've worked with several of our elected officials, we've worked with a whole host of churches, we've worked with the interfaith ministries and the Meals on Wheels and looking at homebound seniors and on and on. And I will say the partnership and collaboration between all of the TMC institutions, between the county, between the city, which have been the major vaccination sites, and then you have hosts of others that have small numbers but on aggregate a lot, has been very purposeful to get to every population in town. We got a long ways to go. We're about a third of the way through the people who are eligible right now, so we got a ways to go, but nonetheless, I think we can get there and we can keep pushing hard. And frankly, these sessions are a big part of that, because we need to continue to reassure and educate and encourage the public on why it is the right thing to do to get vaccinated.
Thanks very much. And Dr. Boone, one more question for you, and then we'll wrap it up for today. What do you think the timeline is for the CDC to approve a vaccine for children under the age of 12?
None of us know that exactly. So what's happening is there's been a series of trials with each of the drugs, with each of the vaccines. So first they've started with kids over 12, right? So, if you look at the vaccines, Pfizer's actually approved at 16. So some teenagers can get vaccinated, but only with Pfizer. Moderna and J&J start at age 18. So if you're an 18 or 19-year-old teenager, you can get it, but not a 16 or 17-year-old. So that leaves obviously anybody from birth to age 15 that's not eligible. I mentioned my daughter, who's 15, is in the Moderna trial. That trial's been moving pretty quickly in terms of getting kind of 12 to 15-year-olds or 12 to 17-year-olds in the other two. And I think we're going to see some data from those trials by the end of the summer. And I'm crossing my fingers that by the school year, or maybe by mid first semester of the school year, It gets tougher when you look at younger kids. It's happening, but they kind of have moved sequentially, and so those are not as far along. My bet is turn of the year or something like that. The challenge will be for them, frankly, is to get results. You actually have to have people get sick, and as we get the rest of the population vaccinated, you're going to see lower numbers. One of the double-edged swords of having things so out of control in the fall was we got answers quicker on the vaccines because we had people getting sick so much. So I think you're looking at teenagers probably, hopefully by fall, you're looking at the next group, which is probably 5 and up, sometime late fall, and I have no idea, after that. But again, those are my best bets right now. I don't have any inside knowledge. So, well, I want to thank everybody for being here today. The hour is upon us, and thank you for the great questions you submitted and a couple that came online during here. You asked very on-point, important questions. If you have additional questions, if you'd like to sign up for the vaccine, you can go to houstonmethodist.org/vaccine, and from there you can just go to our main website, houstonmethodist.org, and there's a banner at the top where you can every day see how many people we vaccinated. You can fill out the form to get on the list. We are doing everything we can to get everybody who signs up scheduled as quickly as we possibly can. As I mentioned, if you're, if you don't have health conditions, it may be a couple weeks, but I think it'll be no more than a couple weeks before you start hearing from us to get yourself on the schedule. I'd encourage you to get on more than one waiting list to get vaccinated. This is one of those things when we all do the right thing together as a community, our community is so much better off. It's a small thing to ask ultimately for each of us to get vaccinated and to get life back to normal for each of us. So I want to thank each of you for being here today. Thank you for your time and attention. I want to thank everyone here, Dr. Sostman, our Chief Academic Officer, as always, for such great advice and great review of the data. Dr. Neal, for all your leadership. This is a man who has helped care for hundreds and hundreds of patients with COVID throughout the last year, so thank you for your amazing service and experience. We got to get you some time off one of these days, and one of the ways we can do that is all get vaccinated. And Arianne, thank you for hosting today. God bless each of you. Have a great day.
Okay, thank you.